Today's daf is daf Chaf, and we'll begin on the bottom of daf Yutes Amud Beis, Maskif La Rav Huna. So if we're counting up one line plus change from the bottom of Yutes Amud Beis, Rav is now the subject of this challenge because Rav says that when is it likuva, when is a particular part of the avoda absolutely critical? That's only if the Torah repeats itself. So if Huna asks him, Vari Melach, with regard to the salting of a korban, to lo tana kra, uma akfa, that even though the word tana means to repeat, miloshan shana, that even though the Torah did not repeat the obligation to add salt, nevertheless we know it's likuva, it's absolutely critical. The Sanya we learned in a brisa, bris melech olam he shetehei, and here we start today's daf on daf chaf, bris amura b'melach divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we derive the conclusion that we are obligated to put salt on top of a korban from this pasuk bris. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he's going to derive the same conclusion, but from a different exegesis. Nemar kan bris melech olam hu v'nemar lahalon. So again, with regard to putting salt on the korban, we have that pasuk, and then we have another pasuk, which is a little bit later on in Parshas Pinchas, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu bestows upon Pinchas as a reward for his act of kanos, bris kahunas olam, kshem shi efshal karbanos below kahuna, kachi efshal karbanos below melach. So once again, both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon agree that adding melach to a korban is absolutely critical. And therefore, let's say, for example, in a case of a korban mincha, you have to add salt. And Rav says that we only derive the likuva, meaning the critical element, if it's repeated. And here it's not repeated. Rav Yosef, Rav Kitana Didan Svirale, Di Omar Lo Malach Kosher. The Tan of our Mishnah holds that malicha, salting the mincha, is not critical, and you could be yotze even without salting. And says Rav Yosef, if that's the Tan of our Mishnah, Rav could accept the opinion of the Tan of our Mishnah. And since it's not repeated twice, therefore we don't know that it's likuva, and it's not likuva. But even though Rav Yosef offers that answer, and he was working with the premise that our Mishnah holds that melach is not liikuva, Amalei Abai says, Rav Yosef, if you're telling me that a mincha without melach is kosher, then lo yatzak nami. Let's say he didn't pour the oil onto the mincha, right, to mix it together with the flour, then we should interpret our Mishnah as saying lo yatzak klal. In other words, according to you, in the case of omitting melach, the korban is kosher, then the same thing should apply to yitzika, which means pouring the oil, that even if there was no yitzik at all, the korban is still kosher. We should apply the same standards to yitzika that we do to malicha, ella lo yotzak kohen elazar. Right? The Mishnah is saying that if a zar did the yitzika, then the mincha is ksheira, but if there was no yitzik at all, the mincha is possible. And if we apply that interpretation to the case of melach, we come to conclusion ochinami lo melach kohen elazar, which means that the Mishnah absolutely requires malicha as critical, just that it doesn't require kahuna. It could be implemented by a zar. And if we come to the conclusion, therefore, says Abai, that our Mishnah agrees that without Yitzika, without Malicha, the korban is possible, that's against Rav, because in the case of Malicha, it doesn't repeat itself. Amalei, so Rav Yosef is not impressed with this kasha of Abaye. V'chisal al daitcha shezar karif legabi mizbeach. In other words, you're assuming that the Malicha was done in our Mishnah by a non-Kohen. How could the non-Kohen, be allowed to participate in placing the salt on the korban mincha? I mean, the Torah says explicitly. I'll read the pasuk: Ach el kli hakodesh v'mizbech lo yikravu, that they're not allowed to come to towards the Azara. Now, the problem is this pasuk is a reference to the Levium, but it applies also to Yisraelim. So therefore, Abaye is now being attacked by Rav Yosef. How could you, Abaye, interpret the Mishnah that the Malicha, the Tzika, was done by a non-Kohen? After all, how could he come close to the Mizbeach? That's prohibited by the Torah. So therefore, we have no choice but to assume that in the Mishnah's case, no one did the Malicha, not a Kohen nor a non-Kohen, and yet the Mincha is Kshera. So the Gemara says that at this point, we can defend Rav, and Iboisem, another defense for Rav, is that came in the Ksiva Be Bris, Keman the Tani Be Kra Dami. The word bris substitutes for a repetition of the requirement of Melech. Now, Rav Huna is based on an assumption that there is only one time in the Torah that the Torah requires placing salt upon the korban. Lo Tani Be Kra. Is this true that the Torah did not repeat itself? V'aksiv v'chol korban minchascha b'melech timlach. So we see a double language here. B'melech timlach. And that means that the Torah is repeating itself, and therefore melach should be likuva, even according to Rav. So Gemara says, wait a minute. That pasuk could only be used as another pasuk to require malicha if we don't need that pasuk for something else. But ahumi boile chedetanya, we need it for the halacha of eitzim. Ilu nemar karba b'melach. If the Torah would have only used the word carbon, which is a more inclusive term with regard to melach, shomea ani afilu eitzim v'dam, I would therefore assume that even if a person brings a carbon eitzim, he voluntarily takes upon himself to bring eitzim, or for example, the dam of zrika on all kodshim, then they should require melach, because if you only had carbon is a generic term, it includes everything. Tamaloma, therefore the Torah says, mincha. Let's see if we could read the pasuk here. V'chol karban minchascha b'melach timlach, and v'lotash b'smelach bris elokecha me'al minchasecha al kol karbancha takriv melach. Okay, so the Bryce is going to say that there's a gewaldige chiddush here in the words kol karbancha minchascha. Why? Because we're going to assume that a korban eitzim, when he brings eitzim to the mizbeach, that that's considered like a mincha. And the dinim that apply to a mincha will apply to eitzim, and therefore melach is going to be required for eitzim. Now you might ask the question, what is the similarity between eitzim and a mincha? And the truth is that the principle of mincha is the mincha requires eish. What do I mean? That after the kmitza, the kometz has to be burnt on the mizbech. So you need eitzim to set up the fire on the mizbech. That's not true in the case of a carbon of eitzim, right? Where the carbon is only eitzim, then you just burn the eitzim on the mizbech. You don't have to bring other eitzim. Meaning you need other eitzim in order to burn the kometz. And this is going to exclude melach for eitzim. Now, as far as dam is concerned, we're going to exclude dam because dam doesn't have to go on the fire. It's just a matter of applying it with the zrika to the side of the mizbeach. However, the Gemara now argues that there is a similarity between dam and mincha. Imam mincha miuchedes shemateres, right? The kometz is a matir, which permits the shirayim. Af kol matir. So maybe when the Torah used the word mincha here as your paradigmic case of requiring melach, it's referring to avi dam shematir any matir. Dam is a matir, right? Because before the dam, the Kohen can't eat the basa, the Israel can't eat the basa in the case of Shlomo. Talmud Lomar. So now we need a pasuk to exclude dam from malicha. Me'al minchasecha velo me'al damecha. You do not apply salt to the dam. Yachol tehei mincha kula te'una melach. Maybe not only does the kometz require mincha, but kula, which I think is referring to the Lavono, let's see if I'm right. Talmud Lomar, Karban. Karban ton melach, v'ei mincha kula te'ula melach. Okay, I'm still not 100% sure I'm right, but let's see. Eli elakometz minai l'rabos es halavona. So in other words, right now at this point, since the kometz requires melach, but eina mincha kula te'una melach, because it says carbon, then maybe I would exclude levona. That levona does not require melach. So the answer is marba niyas halavona shekain ba ima b'kli echad. Right? The kometz and the levona come in one kli sharis that combines them into one, shall we say, hefta shel carbon, and therefore just like the melach, just like the kometz requires melach, so too levona requires melach. So what if a person takes a vow to bring levona on its own? So then it's not put together in a kli with the kometz. Well, and that's one case. And then levona above b'zichin in the case of lechem apanim, where you bring levona in 2 spoonfuls, and there too, there's no kiddush b'kli echad with the omer itself, with the meaning the barley. Right? And then we have ketores, right? Ketores again is not it's not mixed with anything else. So again, let's just review. We're now looking for a ribui to include the following in the requirement of melach: levona, bezichin, and ktoris. What else? Now we have a list of karbonos that are burnt on the mizbeach completely without any additional matir. No, it's not matir. Anything minchas kohanim, which is completely burnt. Minchas kohen Mashiach, which is the minchas chvitin of the kohen gadol twice a day. Minchas nechos nesachim. Emurei chatos, emurei osham, emurei kochi kochim, emurei kochim kalim, evrei ola, ola sa'of, minayin. How do we know that all the above require melach? Talmud Lomar al kol karboncha takriv melach. So we have a ribui with the klal of al kol karbonecha. So the Gemara argues now that since we have a ribui of al kol karbonecha takriv melach, now we have two psukim to require melach. So you might want to say that now we should derive Rav's conclusion that since the Torah repeated itself, it's likuva. But the answer is that we need the pasuk for all these cases which we would not know require melach. So we go back to Rav Huna, who says that the Torah did not repeat itself with regard to the requirement of melach. Omar ainli ela kometz minay l'rabba salavona mar bani salavona shekaim ba ima b'kli echad. So we saw in the brisa that since the mincha, the kometz of the mincha, is brought together one kli with the levona, therefore it requires melach. Va'amrit ma mincha miuchedes shacherim ba'im chovala. In the case of kometz, after you do the kmitza, then you have to burn the kometz on the mizbeach. Okay, so one second. So what is Gemara saying now? So what is Gemara saying now? Again, levona is derived from kol karbonecha, etc. I think what the Gemara is asking now, if I got it correct, is why do I need a special ribui for levona? And that's because ba ima b'kli echad, so therefore it's included in mincha. Forget about that. It's similar to mincha in that it has to be burnt on the mizbeach. So it's acherim boim chovala, meaning you have to bring eitzim on the mizbeach as a result of not only the burning of the komets, but also the burning of the levona. Hachi kamar ema korban klal umincha prat klal upradim klal el mash prat mincha in midiach midi lo. In other words, what the Bryce has in mind is not a separate derivation from the words. Again, let me just turn the page back for a second and read the words of Al kol korbanecha takriv melach, but rather that's a klal that came after a prat, which came after a klal. So it's klal uprat uklal. And that teaches me, I'm sorry, that it's prat and then klal, right? And if it's prat and then klal, then the rule is ein b'klal el masha b'frat, which means it's only mincha and no other carbon. So therefore, Hadar Omar, the Brisa points out that Al Kol Korbanecha Chazav V'Kolal, that it's not just the original klal that came before mincha, now we have another klal, which is called chazar v'kolal, and that's the pasuk of, once again, Al kol korbanecha takriv melach. And now we have a full-fledged klal upratu klal, yet done el ke'ein haprat. So now we look for the profile and the characteristics of a mincha, and then we can expand it so that the requirement of malicha applies to other korbanos. Ma prat b'fur shacherim boim chovalah, af kol shacherim boim chovalah, and therefore we can include Levona, for example, in the requirement of melach. And what else? Let's just see if he has anything else here. Okay, so again, that whole list of karbonos that we had in the Brisa that require burning on the Mizbeach. Gemara says, Achem de boim chovel ma'inin who? Eitzim. Now we should include eitzim. No. I'm sorry. What we're saying is that acherim is a reference to eitzim. In other words, any carbon that requires eitzim to burn on the Mizbeach, like the kometz, is included in the chiyuv malicha. Afkol eitzim, right? Any carbon that's burnt on the Mizbeach requires malicha. So what's the Gemara bothered by? Ema, the icy dam, the ikon esachim. So if you're telling me that what? Acherim boim chovalah is Levona, right? Because Levona has to be burnt on the Mizbeach. You need Aktar Salavona. The icy dam, the ikon esachim. What does that mean? So he says this is an esachim that accompanies the Ola and Shlomim. And he needs the dam in order to be mashlim, to complete the avod of the Ola and the Shlomim, which afterwards will be, part of it, in the case of Ola, all of it will be burnt on the Mizbeach. So therefore, dam should also fit into the category of acherim boim la chovalah. So the Gemara answers no. Nesachim b'hadi imurim hu diyasu. We see the nesachim as part of the imurim, not part of the dam. So you don't bring the nesachim because of the dam, but because of the imurim. Now, this has to do with simcha, as we'll come to in a minute. My timer. Why do we link the nesachim dafka to the haktoras ha'imurim? And the answer is achila and shesiyah. In other words, the emurim, the haktoras emurim, is called achila, and the bringing of the nesachim is called shesiyah. And therefore, the Gemara says that you cannot say, just one second, I'm still trying to figure out where we're holding in the Shaklavatari. You wanted to say that what? That because of the Murim, that's why we bring the Nesachim. And therefore, what? We're not going to link up the Nesachim with the Dam, but rather with the Murim. So my timer, what brings you to that conclusion? To object to connecting the Nesachim to the Dam, but rather prefer to connect the Nesachim to the Emurim, is because Achilu Shesiyah, Adarabba Kapar V'Simcha. In other words, we need a combination of the Dam plus the Nesachim. Once the Dam is brought on the Mizbeach with the Hazan, therefore you have Kapara. Now you're ready for Simcha, which is in this Kayayim. So therefore, I wouldn't want to connect the Nesachim to the Emurim, but rather Nesachim should be connected to the Dam. And if that be the case, if you're connecting what? The Nesachim back to the carbon itself, right? The Ikar Avod is the Dam. The Ikar Kapor is the Dam. Just 1 second. Sorry. On Shabbos I understood this, but 1 second. Since so again, let's go over the logic. You have the Mincha, and after the Mincha, you have the Haktoras HaMincha. And here too, after the Dam, you have the Nesachim. So you have that same kind of structure, that same sort of relationship. And therefore we should require Malicha Ella Levona Ba Ima B'Kli. You're going to say that only the Levona requires what? Requires Malicha because it comes to one Kli with the Komets. Whereas Nesachim ain't Ba B'Kli Echad. Right, you don't put the Nesachim into a Kli together with the Dam. So therefore, we cannot justify the equation between Dam and Mincha. I want to say that just like the Komets will require salty because it comes to be followed by the Haktorah, and therefore the same thing should apply here with Dam. That'll be followed by the Minchas Nesachim. So we can't derive that because we don't have this element of Kli Echad. Because we don't bring the Dam together with the Nesachim in one Kli, Aval Eitzim. Okay, fine. So now you excluded Dam. What about Eitzim? Why not say, like Yehechi de Miskashra Bahu Mincha, Hachi Miskashra Bahu Kula Karbanos? Aval Eitzim. Let's emphasize the word Aval. In other words, we can derive all the other Karbanos requiring Malicha from Mincha. And why? Because of Eitzim. Because just like in Mincha, what follows from the Komets is that you bring Eitzim on the Mizbeach and you burn those Eitzim, and therefore you could burn the Komets. So too in all the other Karbanos, after you bring the Karban, do you need Haktorah al Gabe Eitzim, meaning the Eitzim are brought in order to burn the fire so you could be makriv the Karban on that fire, makriv the Emurim on that fire. So once again, this justifies the Bryce's conclusion that all of these karbonos derived from mincha require malicha. Frekti Gemara, v'ema ma haprat mefurish acherim boim chovalo materes. Maybe you need two elements for the profile of that which equals mincha. Mincha, number one, is acherim boim, because it's burnt with the eitzim, and number two, it's a matir, it's matir the shirayim. And therefore, we can only derive malicha for kol acherim boim l'chov umateres. We need both. Umayninu. So what would be an example of both? Levon above b'zichin d'shar lechem. Right, on Chag, not on Chag, I'm sorry, on Shabbos, right? We have the lechem upon him, and we have the shtei bazichin, and the shtei bazichin will be burnt on the mizbeach, so therefore you need a davar acher, you need a wood, and number two, it's a matir for the lechem upon him, the 12 breads. So I guess what he's saying is that you can't derive eitzim from mincha, because although eitzim has one element, but it's lacking the matir element. And maybe in the case of dam, maybe you have the matir element, but you don't have the davar acher element. So he writes here, I'll just read to you the note, that the klal pratu klal in these psukim limits the comparison to mincha, which is the prat, to only that which has a double element comparison to mincha. Now, all the other korbanos that the Brisa lists as requiring malicha have only one dimension, because the eitzim come afterwards, but none of them have a matir, because they're all burnt totally on the mizbeach, so there's no matir. So therefore, how can you derive from this klal pratu klal that all those karbanos would require malicha when they're not similar to mincha, because they don't have a matir? So the Gemara says, "Mida itzrich me'al mincha secha, v'lo me'al damecha, michal dahanu kulu asu b'chad sad." We don't need a double comparison with both elements. One is sufficient, and therefore dam, which has the matir element and makes it similar to komets of mincha, would have been a natural choice for the requirement of dam, except for the fact that it says me'al mincha secha, and below it's a miyut below me'al damecha. So dam, although it has a single comparison to mincha in that it's a matir, and therefore it should require malicha, it does not require malicha because of this miyut v'lo me'al damecha. But all the other karbanos, even though they only have one dimension of commonality to mincha, that would be enough. Omar mar me'al mincha secha v'lo me'al damecha. Frek the Gemara v'ema me'al mizbechecha, me'al mincha secha v'lo me'al evarecha. Maybe what we have the evarim and the murim that have to be brought on the eish of the mizbeach, maybe they don't require melach, right? Because it says me'al mincha secha, so we have a miyut. How do you know to be b'mayit dam? Maybe be b'mayit evarim. And when it says mistabre evarim havalei l'rebuye, we should include evarim in malicha. Why? Shekain, there are 6 similarities, right? We have this pneumatic device to the mincha. Number 1, acherim boim chavala ki mosa. Right? After you have the evarim, you need to burn the eitzim, like in the case of mincha. Number 2, ishim kimosa. They have to be burnt on the eish of the mizbeach, like the komets. Number 3, bachutz kimosa. They're done in the azara like the mincha, as opposed to other karbonos that have to go bifnim. Nosar kimosa. Right? The evarim are subject to the law of nosar, just like a mincha. Tuma kimosa. If they become tamei, then you're not allowed to bring them on the mizbeach. And me'ila kamosa, if you're moel and you enjoy the benefit of these evarim before they're burnt, then you violate the Isur me'ila, just like the same thing in mincha. But in the case of dam, the similarity between dam and mincha is not true for any of these six. And therefore, if we want to know what to do with this ribui and this miut, we're going to be mamai dam and be marbe evarim. Now we turn to Talmud Beis. Frekti Gemara Adarabba. I do have a great similarity between dam and mincha. And what is that? Dam havilei l'Rabuya shekei matir kamosa. Just like the kometz is matir, the shirayim, so too the dam is matir. The achilas hakohen. Not only that, but dam nifsal b'shkiyas hacham kamosa. Just like a mincha at the end of the day, when the night falls, it is pasul. On this we have this gigantic, famous Tosfos called Nifsal that touches on issues about when is the last time you could daven mincha and so forth and so on. Anyway, so dam has a similarity to mincha, whereas Eivarim do not, because Eivarim can be burnt on the Mizbeach during the course of the night, whereas dam is nifsal b'shkiyas hachama like the komets of mincha. And where it says Hanach Nefishin, right? We had 6 comparisons between the Eivarim and the Mincha. We only have 2 comparisons between the Dam and the Mincha. Therefore, we're going to exclude Dam and include the Eivarim. Omar Mar. And then we have Shomea Ani, Afilu, Eitim, Vidam. Right? The Brisa says, and if you would include both Eitim and Dam in the requirement of Malicha. And why is that? Shenikru Karman. Because both are described and classified by the Torah as Karman. So therefore, I need that Klal Pratu Klal to say Ein B'Klal El Masha B'Frat to derive that we need the similarities to the Mincha, to the comments of the Mincha. Frekta Gemara Man Shamet Leiti Omer Eitzim Ikri Karban. You're in trouble now. You're in deep trouble because the Mandiyom who says that Eitzim are called a carbon is Rebbe, and therefore Rebbe, in the case of Eitzim, is going to require Melach, le Rebbe mi boy bo Melach. And I'm going to prove to you for a Brisa that Rebbe upgrades the status of Eitzim to that of a carbon, has the same status as any other carbon like a mincha, and therefore the dam, according to Rebbe, is going to require melach. And the eitzim are going to require melach. Tisanya, korban, melamish misnadvim eitzim, shnei gzirim, v'chenu omer, vagorolos, hipalnu, I think it's a pasuk in Yechezkel, let's see. No, Nehemiah, sorry. Hagorolos, hipalnu, al korban eitzim. Right? Look at that carbon eitzim. The eitzim are called a carbon. Rebbe Omer, eitzim carbon mincha hen. And therefore, all the requirements of a mincha also apply to eitzim. Uta unim melach, tunim agosha. The Omer Rav, Ludivrei Rebbe, eitzim to unim kmitza. Well, that's impossible. How do you do kmitza on eitzim? You have to chop them up into small pieces. And therefore, since, according to Rebbe, the Torah classifies eitzim as a carbon like mincha, therefore, just like mincha requires kmitza, so too the eitzim require kmitza. It's not enough to burn the eitzim themselves. If a person is misnadev to bring eitzim, he's got to bring other eitzim to burn and burn these eitzim on top of the other eitzim, like any other carbon. Anyway, we see from the Brisa that according to Rebbe, eitzim is considered a full-fledged carbon, and therefore it requires malicha. But yet we just proved that our brisa follows Rebbe, and yet it says that eitzim do not require malicha. And therefore the Gemara says, Sami mikan eitzim. We got to take out the word eitzim from the brisa. The brisa is only excluding dam, but not eitzim, because eitzim is a regular carbon like mincha, and it requires malicha. Elakra lemute mai, ilemute dam, and with this we'll conclude, me al mincha secha nafka. So why do we need a klal pradu klal in order to exclude dam? Because we can't exclude eitzim, And basically, what Rashi and Tosfos are going to point out is that there's a klal pradut klal plus a miut. So we have basically two miutim, and we only have one thing to be mamait from malicha, and that's dam. We're not going to be exclude eitzim because we're going to Rebbe, and Rebbe holds that eitzim requires malicha. So why is it that the Torah has two exclusions? And that's what the Gemara is going to pick up on Daf Chaf Aleph. Okay, then I wish you a great week, and we tried our best to fill in the daf.
Yeah, thank you, Shkoyach.
Okay.